Hi, everybody. Today we have a special guest, an author named Oliver Burkeman. Oliver is someone who wrote a book that I really loved, 4,000 Weeks Time Management for Mortals. And 4,000 weeks refers to the idea that if we live to be about 80 years old, we've had about 4,000 weeks in our lives. And so that really just helps us to see that our lives are finite and then to confront that limited human lifespan and how little time we really have and actually embrace that. And he says that that's the key to living a fulfilling and meaningfully productive life. It's a beautiful book. I sent it to my son-in-law for as a Christmas gift, and he's now come out with a book. I have a what do you call that? Advanced copy called Meditation for Mortals. This is not actually how the book looks. It's pretty nice looking now in the hardcover, but I really like it because it takes that idea from 4,000 Weeks and leads us through a 4-week kind of series of meditations, series of things to read, reflect on, and put into action, on being finite, on taking action, and a lot of other things. So dealing with a lot of the things that we deal with in our lives. Really excited to dive in with him. He's an awesome guy, intelligent, funny, and British. So, pretty refined. Okay, let's go talk to Oliver. All right. Oliver, it is an honor to have you as a guest on this podcast. I'm a big fan of yours, and I'm so glad you said yes to coming on. Thank
The
you.
feeling's mutual. I feel like I've been in reading Zen habits related things for a very long time. Not to make you feel old like I feel, but
Don't
anyway.
worry. I have embraced old as a beautiful thing. So, um, yeah, I was telling you before we started recording, your last book, which was it 4,000 Weeks?
That's right. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, 4,000 Weeks. I gave that as a gift to my son-in-law, who is in a phase of his life where he's really trying to focus on what matters, and not waste so much time. And so I thought it was such an important book along those lines. And so
Oh,
I just
that's
wanted to
great.
say, yeah, thank you for writing that.
No, thank you for gifting it. I am always interested in the concept of like, will does that kind of advice when it's given from your father-in-law land well or not? I'm sure you have a great relationship with him, but even so, anyway, interesting. You got to
he
report back.
Luckily, he took it pretty well. Yes. Yeah, actually, any kind of self improvement, productivity, self help, kind of like in that umbrella type stuff. I'm not trying to like pigeonhole your book,
No, no,
but anytime you give a gift like that, there is a danger. So yeah.
right. You don't want to give the book that says like how to sort out the chaos of your miserable life to somebody
Yeah,
who
that's right.
who
How
you
to
think is
stop being such a
right.
huge mess. um, so here's something I'm interested in. So that book, when did that come out? 2 or 3 years ago?
Yeah, 2021.
2021. Okay, so a few years ago. And now you've got a new book coming out, and I have it in my hands. So I'm one of the lucky few. Meditation for Mortals. Um, and so I'll show this here. And this might sound like a little bit of promotion, but I'm actually glad to promote things that I think people in this podcast will really benefit from. Um, and so you went from 4,000 Weeks to Meditation for Mortals. And I could see, you dove deeper into themes that were very present in that last book. But I'm curious for you, what had you write this book? What go from that book to this book? Tell me a little bit about
Yeah,
that.
sure. Um,
Yeah.
so, I mean, the first thing I'm finding myself saying as the book goes out into the world is that it's not a book about meditation, right? It's if I'm borrowing if I'm sort of arrogantly borrowing a tradition, it's not so much the Buddha's as like Marcus
Right, right.
Aurelius's. I guess it's meditations in that sense,
Yeah.
sort of thoughts and insights. Maybe for me, what was so the focus of this book, obviously, it really looks at, as you say, those the same sort of broad issues of human finitude and limitation, and how we
Mm-hmm.
can sort of come to terms with that and even benefit from embracing that. But for me, I think this book is about uh, going from the state of knowing what it is you want to be doing with your life, and the things you want to be including in your day, the ways you want to be showing up in the world, and like actually doing it. And I think one of the
Mm-hmm.
things that I found in the aftermath of writing 4,000 Weeks was, I think writing that book about time and our experience of time and
Mm.
productivity and efficiency, I really had a strong feeling of like, okay, I think I've understood something important here. Doesn't follow that you're going to live differently. And I
Mm.
think that was even true for some readers who said like, okay, I really benefited from the perspective shift, but like, then what? So
Yeah.
I wanted in this book to really address this question of like
Mm.
action, and how to sort of almost sort of how to rescue the idea of action from, you know, productivity culture and hustle culture and all the rest of it, and explore whether there's a way of sort of embracing these ideas of peace of mind and presence and calm and stillness that are
Mm.
consistent with like doing stuff, because it's important to do stuff and it's okay to be ambitious and to want to do stuff. And so that's really the territory in my mind.
I love that. Okay, well, I want to dive into that theme, but before we do, you mentioned a word, and I'm going to say it wrong because I've only seen it written until you just said it. Finitude? Is
Right.
that the right way to say it? Okay.
I think so. I mean, several people have accused me of inventing this word. I certainly didn't. But just the state of being finite, right? So
Right.
that's what it means. And I think it's finitude.
Yeah, finitude. Okay, so it was a big theme of your last book. I haven't. I'll confess, I haven't fully read this
No,
book
no.
yet. So, but it seems like this. It's a big theme of this book. Tell me how you hit upon that as a theme for yourself.
Wow. I mean, obviously, and I'm sure you know this from the inside, right? All this kind of anything that looks like advice writing or anything else is on some level a record of the author's own struggles, and maybe even the advice that they need to hear as much as anybody
Yeah,
else. And I don't. We can talk about that. I don't think there's any problem with that actually, but
absolutely.
it's not always admitted, I suppose. Um,
Yeah.
and for me, the finitude thing is really a sort of long, slow process of realizing that wherever I go wrong with how I'm using my time, or wherever sort of anxiety and uh, worry really sort of have consumed me, I think one way of understanding what's going on there in my life and in other people's is a sort of an attempt to not feel what it means to be a finite human, an attempt to not fully
Mm,
inhabit the
mm,
the state that we have of being limited in time, limited in our control over that time, limited in how much we can understand anything or other people, um, and to sort of pushing against those sort of built-in limits and trying to get to this place where I would finally be on top of everything or finally know what I was doing. And it's always in the
mm.
future, of course. You never actually get there. And how uh, that sort of struggle is really the core of a lot of mental, psychological suffering. So sometimes people say, well, this is a book about death and mortality. And like, yeah, sure. All of this is true only because we die. Um, but it isn't. There are other people who've done really great, amazing writing on kind of literally death and mortality, and I think of the distinction of finitude being more like it's the it's what it is to be alive, given that we die,
Mm.
rather than that I'm sort of focused on on death, uh, as it were. And I think
Sure.
that I yeah. So yeah, we can talk about it more, but that's the real sort of core of it for me.
Yeah, I mean, death is a real limit for all of us. And what I hear from your books is that you really embrace that limit. You have the idea of like this, that there is a limit here, and let's actually like make use of these limits.
Absolutely. And I think that one way of understanding all sorts of kind of pathologies of time, procrastination, impatience, anxiety, worry, all the things that sort of we on some level would like not to be afflicted by, they are all attempts to kind of, they're efforts of denial of those limits. They're efforts to sort of maintain this fantasy of one day not being in this position that the psychotherapist Bruce Tift sort of brilliantly talks about, being claustrophobic, imprisoned, and constrained by just reality. And the big discovery for me that I have to keep on making again and again, apparently, and it's definitely in the core of this new book, is that actually just completely or even partially admitting defeat, surrendering that struggle, is not only more in tune with reality and a path to peace of mind, but it's actually a path to getting more meaningful stuff done, because you're no longer kind of distracted by this futile struggle to do everything or feel completely in control. And then suddenly it's like, oh wow, okay, so I can just like launch interesting projects and commit to relationships and go on trips, and like I don't need to wait for the time when it's all going to feel like I know what I'm doing.
Yeah, I'm still waiting for that time.
Yes, it's never coming.
Personally, it's interesting, talking about embracing these real limits. I remember hitting upon a similar idea, and at one point, this is years ago, I called it haiku productivity, because the haiku has a limited number of syllables. And it's not like you can write pages and pages of a poem. It's
Yep.
forces you, those constraints forces you to choose.
Mm-hmm.
And so I really found power in that, being like forcing yourself to choose, like realizing that we only have a certain number of hours in a day, and there's actually power in that, being willing to like curate. And yeah.
Sorry. No, and just to say,
No, go
like,
ahead.
when it comes to our situation as humans, like, in a sense, as many people have said, like, you're already choosing anyway. It's a question of doing that consciously. So
Yeah.
an awful lot of what I'm sort of pointing at, I think, is the empowerment that comes from more fully recognizing the way things actually just already are. So it's not about me saying, hey, you should only do one thing at a time. It's more about saying, like, do you see that you are by definition already only doing one thing at a time, and what can come from stepping more authentically into that, and many other examples.
Beautiful. Okay, so taking these like realizations of our limits and deciding to choose, and then actually putting it into action. Um, so I'd love to like dive into this. And one thing that was funny, I think when we were looking at like what to talk about in this podcast, you put a note to the table of contents of the book is a good place to start. And I read it and I'm like, oh my God, there's so many topics here that are so incredible. I don't think I can actually cover all of it. So we're going to have to choose.
Yep.
So here's how I'd like to start with this. You talked about, the writing that we do in a large part being advice for ourselves. And I love that. You talked about Marcus Aurelius's meditations. I think his meditations, from what I understand, was advice to himself, right? Just reminders
Yeah.
of his own mortality and how he wanted to live life. So, in that sense, I'd love to hear how this book is advice for you. And specifically, what I'm curious about is what struggles do you have around putting this stuff into action, where this book is good advice for you.
Yeah. So there's sort of two levels to that. On the sort of, that come to mind anyway, on the sort of at high level, it's been a sort of really interesting and important thing for me to realize that all this all this good stuff about psychological growth and change, and hopefully, getting better at doing life in some way, is just an ongoing, open-ended process that really requires endless reminding, and to feel no shame about the fact that you fall off the wagon and get back on it, and that's just sort of that's the system working, rather than you not doing it right. So the structure of this book, which is in sort of 4 weeks of short daily chapters, I don't really imagine I can control how people read it, but one way you could read it is a chapter a day for a month, just a short chapter each day in the morning, maybe. It's designed to have that feeling, to be a sort of retreat of the mind, is the phrase that I use. To sort of be something that keeps going at these themes and sort of wears their way into you and under your skin. And so, the structure of it is advice for me, in the sense that embracing that way of doing this is important to me. Excuse me.
I love that.
Then, in terms of the 4 weeks, they're loosely designed in a sort of a journey that is a journey that I think I'm on myself. And the first one is kind of the first week is called Being Finite. It's about confrontation, really, with just the stark facts of what it means to be limited. The second week is called Taking Action, and it's about taking sort of bold and meaningful action in that situation of being a finite person. Third week is called Letting Go, and it's about all the different ways in which actually, and a crucial part of this is actually sort of unclenching and getting out of the way of action. So not making it happen, but letting it happen, allowing the idea that actually a lot of action is happens, and the most meaningful things happen when we allow them to happen naturally. The problem is that we were in their way with our control-y tendencies, rather than that we needed to sort of work up the motivation to do them. And then the fourth week is called Showing Up, and it's sort of the implication is that that's the culmination of this journey, is to sort of participate more fully and vividly in life. Anyway, that's all a long way of saying it's week 3 that is my problem.
Week 3, okay. That's the one I wanted to ask about anyway.
The letting go, definitely.
Okay, great.
I'm sure I'm not alone among your audience in being someone who sort of, historically in my life anyway, is definitely sort of intellect first, brain first, trying to sort of schedule things right.
No, I think you're the only one.
Adopt the right morning routine. Yeah, maybe there's only me who's just a freak.
No.
And to sort of take that top-down idea, and the idea that, and of course, it's got this very deep undertow of like, well, I must do this, otherwise I wouldn't be justifying my existence, or like things will go terribly wrong if I'm not really kind of clenching the steering wheel the whole time. So yeah, that's where it's really advice to me. I mean, it's advice to me in all the weeks, but some of the weeks I feel like it's advice that I have managed to internalize, and then there's parts where I'm still very much internalizing it.
Okay, so let's dig into this week a little bit. The letting go theme. You talked about a lot of times action flows naturally if we get out of our own way. And so, what are some of the ways not only you get in your own way, but like we tend to get in our own way, and like how does that actually work? Because it's very counterintuitive that like letting go will actually let action flow a little bit better sometimes.
There's a really lovely observation which I quote in there. Each of these days has a quotation at the top of it that is closely related, and there's a quotation in there from the Zen teacher Kosho Uchiyama, who says, say I get this right, life completely unhindered by anything manifests as pure activity. And so the sort of starting point here is the idea that it is, everything we either understand or intuit about change being constant and the world being a interconnected web of people and energies and everything, all points to the idea that if you can relax your grip a bit, it isn't the case that you'll just end up like sitting on the couch all day doing absolutely nothing. Things want to happen through you. That's sort of the nature of human psychology, and maybe it's the nature of reality in some sort of deep and spiritual way. I don't know. And so I really think it's important to see how often the problems that we have in building what feels like a meaningful life are really through it's not the absence of something, namely motivation or energy or something. It's the presence of a sort of a barrier. So there may be people who experience, for example, procrastination as just a sort of absence of any energy or motivation. But I think it's pretty clear, at least for a lot of people who are troubled by that, which is, ultimately everybody I think is troubled by some version of it. It's some emotional struggle that's going on. It's an inhibition. It's something that you're doing that is getting in the way because your standards are perfectionistic, or because you think the stakes are so high that you don't dare to act. And there are kind of 100 different reasons, but they all have that idea of sort of standing in the way. So a couple of concrete examples. There's a chapter in that week about how difficult it can be, ironically, for a certain kind of person, of which I am one, to allow the possibility that what you're doing, some challenge you're facing, whatever, might be a lot easier than you expected it to be. So you have these lovely lines. Elizabeth Gilbert has this line about how you have to be willing to let it be easy. Tim Ferriss has this sort of question: what would this look like if it were easy? As a way of, and in all these cases, it's quite scary for a certain kind of person. I keep saying that, a somewhat neurotic, somewhat controlly, somewhat anxiety inclined kind of person, to actually ask, oh, what if this were easy? Or a related question when it comes to productivity, especially, like, what do I feel like doing right now? Not what does the productivity system dictate that I must do, but like, what do I actually feel like doing? And I'm not claiming that you can go through a whole life like never doing anything that you find somewhat unpleasant, but it's really quite subversive, I think, for a lot of people to actually allow that possibility. And yet it makes total sense, because if you do desire to do certain things, it's what a shame to have a sort of productivity system that is based on sort of systematically suppressing that, when you could be co-opting those energies, and letting them power you forward.
It's so opposite of how we're trained. Like, we're trained to do what we're supposed to do, not what we feel like doing. And like it's like we're trained from a young age out of that.
Yeah, I go on a little rant at one point about the sort of focus in a lot of personal development stuff about taking decisions that your future self will thank you for, right? This is like a big deal. And it's not bad advice, right? I'm not saying like that's all wrong. But I do think that's sort of, deferring gratification is what that's about. It's like being good at the famous marshmallow test, right? Where you can resist one marshmallow because you're going to get another one later. This is all good stuff, but I think that at least for the kind of people who are drawn to that kind of thinking, it's pretty likely that your problem is the opposite, right? It's like, and I certainly think this has been my problem in life earlier, deferring gratification too much, turning your whole life into this kind of relentless grind towards the future point at which you get all the marshmallows, and never eating a marshmallow, which, it's a sugary snack, and so it's not a great example, I suppose. But if the meaning of life is metaphorically to eat marshmallows, then spending your whole life acquiring them and never getting to the eating point is just as much of a mistake as just being so completely irresponsible with your time that that you're storing up trouble for the future.
Yeah, it's like we are taught that tool to delay gratification at a young age, and then every time we see like a problem that we don't know exactly how to solve, we apply that tool, and so we're applying it pretty much all the time.
Right.
Um,
Right.
yeah, and so we never eat the marshmallow. I love that idea. Um, okay, uh, so relaxing and letting go, letting things be easy is another thing that is actually not what we're taught. Like we are actually taught to devalue what's easy and like
Right.
only value things if they're really hard. So it seems like if you decide like, okay, I'm going to let this be easy, it's a scary thing. From what to
Right, because
back what you're saying.
yeah, and it has this sort of, there's this moral layer that I think really gets in the
Right.
way, where we sort of, we feel like we need to justify our existence on the planet on some level, and I talk about this in another part of the book as the sort of idea of productivity debt, the idea that you sort of wake up in the morning and you feel like you haven't quite earned your right to be here unless you get through a certain amount of output in the course of the day, and that's associated also on the easiness question with like the feeling of effort, and it's pretty easy, and it works in both directions, right? You could, if you do something in 20 minutes because it comes naturally to you and it's no effort, you sort of demean it and you think it's not valuable, and so people who have a natural skill for something are very often prone to sort of not respect that skill because it does come too easily to them. On the other hand, we're prone to think that if you spent the whole day like really, really effortfully doing stuff, then that stuff must by definition have been useful and meaningful stuff, but maybe it wasn't, right? And maybe a better day would have been spent, putting in a couple of hours of work and spending the rest of the day at the beach. I don't know. So
it's the wrong metric.
Right, and it is the wrong metric, and we're doing it, I think, a lot of the time because we're seeking this state of, I mean, it's quite a religious idea, really. We're sort of trying to save our souls somehow through our work. It is specifically the religious idea of like the sort of Protestant work ethic that has done so much damage to Western culture, anyway.
Yeah. Okay. So I love all of this. Thank you for sharing all of that. I can relate to a lot of it. The next part I want to get to is there's a couple of things here that you touch on. Trying to see which part. You'll just have to tell me.
No, it's fine.
So some common problems that people that I talk to face a lot. And I'd like to just get your take on it. We're going to do the opposite of your book. Your book spaces out this kind of learning. I'm going to try and cram it all into one
Great, yeah.
podcast. Yeah.
It's very important to be as efficient as possible in life, Leo.
Exactly.
Right, yeah.
We're gonna put as much value into this podcast as possible.
Optimize. Yeah.
Yeah. And no, I love that we can touch on this and people can actually go through the journey in your book. By the way, I have a advanced reader's copy which I'm not allowed to sell. It is very clear, but I think I can give it away. So I'm gonna give this book away to one of our readers. Is that okay?
It is, although I think we now probably have I shouldn't make this promise on the recording if I can't back it up, but I think we now have lovely hardback finished editions. And
okay.
And I think we could arrange for a reader to receive one of those, but maybe don't hold me to that until I've checked out with the publisher.
Well, I just really like the idea of passing on books.
Yeah,
I read them and then pass them on. So I'm gonna give this away to a reader. And if you want to give me a hard copy to give away too. So if you want a copy, email me at podcast@zenhabits.net. I might give you one. Okay, so here's a problem that people get a lot. This is going to be really basic for you, but a lot of people have this. I have a million things. So I'm overwhelmed because my to-do list is never ending. I took a break over the weekend and my inbox is flooded. I have so many things to respond to, and it just feels like I'm trying to keep my head above water. So um, feel free to just take that as a going off point.
How to respond to
Yeah,
when one is in that situation, and it's not
yeah.
that basic. I mean, it's basic, but I get it. And with actually something an ironic thing I've found. It's a lovely problem to have, but because 4,000 Weeks did kind of better than I expected, and now there's this book. It's like I write all this stuff about handling overwhelm, and then I get more overwhelmed as a result of putting it out there, and have to really sort of learn my own lessons again.
Beautiful.
So one is always dancing between, perspective shifts and sort of techniques and methods. And I actually think I have a whole thing about how actually I think the perspective shifts are ultimately the more practical and actionable things. So I'll start with that. But I think that when you're really overwhelmed with a large amount of little stuff in that way, that's the real moment when it's incredibly easy to think to yourself, that's the moment when it's incredibly easy to think to yourself, okay, all these ideas about being chilled out and making choices and being calm are great. But first of all, I've just got to get all this email out of the way. and it's like, this will be an exception. A few days, I'll just get back in control. And, there are people who can do that in a calm way, but for many of us, I think that is really the first wrong step, right? You make that's a mistake. It's right then, in the middle of the overwhelm, that it can be really helpful to sort of stop and take a breath and see that while it might be an unusual moment in terms of your email inbox, basically what we're dealing with here are infinite supplies of things. You're not going to get to the end of the emails or the to-dos or anything. That's not how it works for finite humans. And so if it is important to address yourself to, for example, email, then the spirit in which one can, and I try when that happens to address myself to it, is not one of like, let me just tighten all my muscles and furrow my brow and really try to get through to the end and then stop. Because of course the other thing that happens with email is, half the people you reply back to you, so it doesn't stop you.
By the time you've done 2 more emails, the responses are coming in.
Exactly. So a very simple and obvious way to do that, and I'm not telling anyone anything they don't know, but maybe recontextualizing it a little bit, is to take a sort of time first approach and to say, okay, 20 minutes of focus on my email, then a little walk around the block, then another 20 minutes of focus on my email. So something about thinking in terms of little portions of time, I think is a good and simple way to sort of reframe away from that kind of conquest mode. And then I think the other thing is to really try to tune into that question of like, what would I like to do right now? When you're in a real psychodrama with this stuff, it can feel like, okay, I just don't want to look at my inbox. And I've done this, you sort of you make the problem worse because you just don't want to go there. And you think what I actually want to do, you tell yourself, is like surf social media or, just zone out, whatever. In fact, if you get a little bit quiet and relaxed and tune into that thought, what do I want to do really? Very often what happens is, okay, well, maybe actually what I really want right now is to go on like a 20-minute stroll around the neighborhood and just sort of breathe. But then you come back and it's like, actually, I would like to address myself to some of those emails. I think that the really extraordinary thing that I find is that when you really deeply connect to that question of what you want to do, you find that actually you do kind of want to be a responsible member of society and pay your bills and keep your promises to people and answer emails. So I think
it's not just fear-based.
Right. No, exactly. And understanding that what you're doing is swimming in an infinite sea. You're not drinking down a glass of water that you'll get to the end of it, and then that's that. You're just swimming in an infinite sea and applying your energy and attention in the way that seems wisest uh, at that moment. There's a whole other interpersonal level to this, which is like a lot of what's going on here a lot of the time is the thought that like other people are mad at you or something, and you know that can happen because people are in jobs where if they don't respond quickly to all their emails they get a lot of grief. But there is a role here as well for like, don't go exaggerating your own importance or the degree to which the world's going to collapse if someone doesn't get a response to an email for another hour or two, because it's probably not going to.
Yeah, there might be some truth to it. We take that truth and exaggerate it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it just turns into a big fear of like,
I'm
everyone's
always
going to be so upset with me.
right. I
Yeah.
think it's important to be sensitive to the fact that like me and I think you are people with an extraordinary degree of autonomy over how the day goes. And there are definitely people in much sort of tighter situations when it comes to having to be responsive to email. But even there, you don't have to bring this existential layer of like, I'm not a good person if I don't get through all this. Maybe in a
Mm.
much more sort of down to earth way, the terms of one's employment are such that you have to answer all emails from a certain person or category of person. But you still don't have to feel like you didn't earn your right to exist if you don't do an impossible amount of that in the course of the day.
Mm. Um, okay, beautiful answer. Thank you for sharing that. I'd love to go back to this book, but the angle I'd like to look at it in is the phase where you're writing it,
Okay.
which I'm sure it was a few months ago at least. Um, so you're in the phase of like creating this book, and in it, I'm sure you're facing some of the same problems that you're writing about.
Oh, yes.
And so I'm curious, if there were anything in the book that you employed to actually create the book. I'll stop with that question. There's another thing that I have, but that'll be a follow-up question. Yeah, anything that
Yeah,
you use to create the book.
yeah, totally. And this
So,
is a really like it's an on point and sort of perceptive question, because when I say that I'm writing advice for myself and I'm talking about action, obviously, trying to write a book is a big creative action where all these issues come up and it becomes very central. Everything we've been talking about. So many of them, but I will say just on the sort of letting go front.
mm,
Sounds a little bit like I'm bragging or something, but 4,000 Weeks did quite a lot better than I was expecting it to do, and has been read by quite a lot more people than I would ever have imagined would have read it. And that led to a completely predictable, very, very cliched kind of freeze response, right?
mm,
Where you sort of think, oh my God, like I've got to, firstly, there's that thing where if you meet a standard, you feel like you've got to, that then becomes the minimum standard that you've got to meet next time, which
right.
is very oppressive. And then you also just think like, if I mess up this time, lots of people are going to be watching where they previously weren't. Elizabeth Gilbert, whose book Eat, Pray, Love
Did pretty
was
well.
a success on a rather bigger scale than anything I've ever written, has written very, very vividly about this, and I might not be on anything like her scale, but the feelings were
Sure.
quite similar to the ones that she expressed. It's like, millions of people have read Eat, Pray, Love. It's like, I can't write another book for millions of people. I've got to write it for one or two people and go from
Right.
there.
Thanks for
So
sharing this, by the way. I think it's little talked about. I know Elizabeth did talk about it. I'm saying it like I know her. Me and Liz.
yeah,
So, but it's important to hear about, and I think we can dismiss it as like, oh, those are good problems to have, but they're
yeah,
real problems, and
yeah,
I
yeah.
appreciate you sharing that.
Absolutely, both are true. Good problems to have,
Right.
still real. And one of the things that sort of got me past that phase was doing all sorts of kind of free writing exercises, where you just sort of set a timer and keep your fingers moving and cover the page, of a sort that honestly I had always been really disdainful of. I'm like, they're for amateur writers, and I'm a professional. I just sit down and do what I need to do. And that willingness in an early stage of this project to just sort of make a mess on the page. I say early stage because I don't think it remains just a mess on the page. It went through a lot of, thinking and reconceptualizing, and then work of some brilliant editors. But the willingness to do that, even when literally nobody was ever going to see it, was it was a layer of, feel like I've in many ways got past being a sort of
for sure
cramped and anxious perfectionist. But no, it turns out there was really another level there, which was I was still expecting that the first time I sat down to write a sentence, it should basically be a coherent and good sentence. And
that's fascinating, because I don't think this is talked about enough, but what you're talking about is exactly what someone faces when they first start writing, right? Like, I can't make a mess. It has to be, quality stuff, which as experienced writers, we know that doesn't make any sense, right?
Yeah.
So they're facing that, and the exercise is to get them over that. You've overcome that, and now at this new level of success, it comes back, and the same tools
totally
apply.
Yeah,
And
no, absolutely. Yeah, there's always another level of that kind of of that problem, and I think there was a book called Deep Free Writing by a writer called Stephen Lloyd Webber, which was one of them that was very significant just at the right moment. And he writes in that book about doing like 24-hour free writing marathons, where he and a friend like booked a motel room and took their computers and just like wrote for 24, and like something like that will really snap you out of the idea that what you're writing has got to be good stuff. He's talking, and I experienced this. It's a switch from saying, I'll sit at the computer, and once I can think of something good to write, I'll write it. It's a switch to saying, I'll sit at the computer and I'll write, and maybe one or two of those things will be good. The idea that you write before you're confident that there's any particular ideas, good ideas to write, is a very powerful reframing, I think.
I love that. So that actually got you over that, like, perfectionist, like, I need to actually write something of the same quality and to that standard.
Yeah, and I think, and I think what came out, I hope it is the eventual result is of the same standard in some sense, but I think it is more conversational and more sort of candid in some sense. I think it is more sort of direct and a little bit less of a sort of a writing performance, as it were. And both of those have their value. I'm not sort of repudiating the last book. I just think it's like that was the next thing that needed to come out of me, as it were.
I love it. Okay, here's the follow-up question I have. So you talked about, having some freedom over your time, which is a beautiful luxury to have, and it can come with, some difficulties. Oh, sorry.
No. Sorry, no. I was just adjusting my setup here. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'm going to make a note of this time. We can cut this piece out. Okay. So having so much freedom over your time can actually be a difficulty for a lot of people. And so I'm curious for you, someone who is working with finitude and some of these concepts, in the phase where you're writing this book, what did your days end up looking like? Were you writing, every single minute of the day? Were you eating marshmallows and going to the beach? Tell us more.
Well, we live these days in sort of quite remote hills of Yorkshire in northern England. So actually the beach isn't that far. It's about 45 minutes away, but it's not the kind of beach you people on the Pacific time zone envisage when you say
very
beach,
different.
right? It's like a sort of very windswept and freezing beach. No, I mean, so I have a lot of freedom in the middle of the day, basically, but we have a 7-year-old son, and I'm part of a family. And so actually there's plenty of those sort of a lot of becoming a parent for me has been about sort of understanding both the limits of my control over my time and actually the surprising benefits of not having that control. But yeah, there's a big chunk of most days when I do broadly get to decide the order that things go and where I am when I'm doing it. And I also write about this in the book. What it always comes back to, at least in the good times, there are definitely scattered times when I'm sort of not focusing enough, but what it always comes back to in the good times is 3 or 4 hours of really proper good focus on the main thing that I'm doing, the writing. And that's not just writing. It could be walking around up in the hills and making notes and drawing little nerdy diagrams and things which are all part of my writing process. But it's not an attempt to do that for 10 hours a day, even when I have 10 hours to dictate, how they go. It's a sort of gradual recognition that, even at the most sort of deadline is approaching, high stress moments of a project like that, it doesn't actually help to go sort of all in for hours and hours and hours and hours. There's a academic called Robert Boyce, who you might have come across, who's done all sorts of research into academics writing habits of university professors, and found that the people who actually produce the most are the ones who make writing into a sort of a modest part of their daily routine, and who don't just say, well, okay, 3 hours has gone, but I'm on a roll, so let's keep going as long as I can. Because you're sort of reinforcing an impatient, rushing urge there, a sort of feeling that you need to get to the end of it. And there's something very powerful about putting in a few hours and then stopping, even if you don't quite feel that you want to stop. And then, as one author whose name I am forgetting, a female novelist whose name is escaping me right now, has written brilliantly about how when you stop that period of focus, if you possibly can, you should go for a walk or take a shower, or not just go to your emails. You should leave some little gap, which is when you're going to get probably going to get all the best ideas of that session, right? They're going to pop up at that point. So I try to work that sort of, on a really good day, 3 or 4 hours, a walk, and then more administrative things until after.
How would you decide when your stopping point is? If you have this idea of I want to stop before I'm fully, I've fully used up all my creative energy, how do you determine it?
Well, you can do it with timings. I sort of alternate. So sometimes it is I'm going to just do that many hours. I guess I alternate partly based on where I am in a book project. Once you're really at the stage where you're writing a lot of stuff, I think it's incredibly helpful to have kind of little outcome goals. And in the book and elsewhere, I've referred to them as daily deliverables, which is a wonderfully soulless corporate phrase that I actually think it's quite helpful that it's so soulless and corporate, because it bleeds all the drama out of it. It's okay, what's your deliverable? Off it goes on the conveyor belt. And that doesn't necessarily need to mean that you finish a chapter or something. It could be the structure of a chapter or the brain dump for a chapter. It could be all sorts of much more sort of intermediate things, but having a notion of what that completion would look like and being able to say, okay, yeah, there it is, printed out and sitting on the desk. That's really powerful for me.
Surprising benefits of not having complete control over your time is something that you said. Can you share a little bit more about that? I'd love to hear.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a lot of people's experience of parenthood, but I think it comes in other walks and areas of life as well. That it's not that you're surprised, most people anyway, to enjoy being a parent. It's that you're surprised that actually the part where you don't get to determine exactly what you're doing at each point of the day is a part of the enjoyment very often, because there is a sort of sense of being a part of something bigger and being synchronized with the rhythms of, newborn baby, something. It's long enough ago for me. I think it's even longer ago for you. That particular sort of intense moment of like you really just, when the baby needs feeding, the baby needs feeding. When the diaper needs changing, the diaper needs changing. And there's something, it's not always pleasant work, but there's something very freeing about just falling into line with that, which again is something that people find in more traditional religious communities that have those kind of temporal rhythms, and all sorts of areas of life. Also, there's just the much more sort of blunt fact that, and this is a separate section of the book, but sort of to define something as an interruption, to say I'm not going to be interrupted for the whole of the next day or something, is to sort of decide in advance that what you plan to happen is definitely the best thing that could happen for you and people around you, which is a little bit kind of, again, it's trying to be sort of godlike when actually a limited human is what we are. I don't mean that you should not try to sort of ring fence a few hours for focus, which is what I was talking about before, but not struggling to ring fence every single hour, I think, is a very useful, because it actually just makes interruptions worse, right? If I've decided that 4 p.m. to 6 p.m. I must do this and no one must interrupt me, it's a lot more disruptive if my son then comes into my office and wants to talk than if I am not adopting the attitude that would be a terrible thing. It doesn't mean you have to just stop focusing and be interrupted if you're in the middle of something important. But it does mean that, you maybe turn to the person who's interrupting you and look them in the eyes and say, I actually just going to need a few more minutes on this before I turn to that. And, it's all kind of fluid and works nicely. And then you're back to what you were doing. The point is just that sort of very specific mindset of okay, this is my schedule for the next few hours, and anything that happens that doesn't exactly accord with that is somehow a problem. Well, it might be a problem, but it also might not be a problem.
Yeah. Absolutely love that. It reminds me of when I started meditating, and I'm like, I'm going to be focused and meditating, and anytime someone would interrupt my meditation, I'd be so upset. And I realized that was the point of my meditation. So
right.
to turn toward all of it.
There's a quote in there in that section of the book from C.S. Lewis, obviously writing from a Christian perspective, but he says, I'm paraphrasing, but he says something like, it's incredibly tempting to define everything that happens in life, all the interruptions, as somehow a violation of your own or real life. And then he says, in fact, of course, the interruptions are precisely one's real life, the life God is sending one moment by moment. And I think that, whether you have God in that understanding or not, I think that's a really, really important perspective to balance the one about, these are my focus hours, leave me alone.
I think that's a really good place to end. You mentioned the word soulless, which is, you embraced a soulless technique, which I really love. But I think it was so interesting because the way that I read you is bringing kind of the soul back to all of this.
Oh, that's lovely. That's if the stuff I'm writing is doing that, I'm thrilled.
Well, and I want to thank you for that. You've changed the conversation around productivity and using our time and what we're tackling in life.
Thank you. I think we're standing on the shoulders of giants of whom you are one, because I feel like ever since I was writing my Guardian column back in the day, I was drawing on and quoting from you. So it's really excellent to get to have this conversation at last.
Oh, beautiful. I will take that credit and also any royalties that you want to share with me. But Oliver, thank you for your time. I'll let you get back to, I think you're at a festival or a literary festival. I appreciate you taking the time to actually talk with us.
Thanks, Leo. It's been a real pleasure.
Man.